Hi, my name is Mike Barrett from acethelsat.com, also from testingiseasy.com. And in this brief video, I want to share with you some really important things that you need to know before you get ready for the LSAT. Even if you've already started getting ready for the LSAT, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and watch this anyhow. I can't tell you how many times a new student comes to me, whether they have never started with the LSAT before or they've been doing something with some other program for a while. And I speak to them a little bit, and it becomes kind of clear that they don't know a few foundational things about the LSAT. So I wanted to go ahead and make this video, hopefully save you the trouble of learning these things later on if you're about to get started with the LSAT. Or if you've been working on the LSAT for a while and you don't know some of these things well, this will be helpful as well. Better late than never, right? So let's go ahead and start with some basic things, and then at the end I want to throw in some thought-provoking ideas. Not that you necessarily have to decide that you agree with me on those things, of course, but I think they're things that you'll be happy that you considered at least, and I also think you should agree with me, but we'll see how that goes when we get there. Anyway, let's start with the basics. So, it's very important to understand that the LSAT counts extremely heavily in this process. Now, you may think that that's something everybody knows, but I'm not sure that everyone understands the degree to which the LSAT figures into the process. It's true that when you apply to undergrad programs, perhaps the SAT and the ACT, those scores could be overcome in certain cases in undergrad, depending on how good your essays were and stuff like that. There's also, of course, ways to graduate from a four-year degree institution without ever actually taking the SAT if you go in through community college and things like that. There isn't anything like that in law school. In law school, the LSAT is probably the biggest determining factor in the vast majority of cases at the vast majority of schools. So your LSAT score needs to be up there. If your LSAT score is outside the range that was getting accepted to your school in the last couple of years, I would say honestly it's going to be basically impossible to get in. Now, I'm not saying that to scare you, it's just that you should know it beforehand. It's better to know it now and be able to do something about it perhaps than to find out later when you can't do anything about it. So the LSAT is extremely important if you are applying to any kind of school with a competitive application situation. Now, another thing you need to know along these lines is that many schools will average multiple scores. This means, just in case you don't know what average means, it means that if you take the test once and you get a 150, and then you take it again and you get a 170, a school that averages will actually count that as a 160. Even though your 170, of course, is quite impressive, they're going to count that as a 160. Now, some schools say they average all scores no matter what. Some schools say they average the scores after the first two. Some say we reserve the right to average, but we might not. Whatever, you just need to know that this is a possible thing. It's not like when you apply it to undergrad and places would take your highest SAT or your highest ACT or whatever. Here, they're going to average multiple scores, or they might at least average multiple scores. The best way to find out is to call up your target schools on the phone and say, hey, listen, what do you do with multiple scores? But the best thing, honestly, I mean even better than that, of course, is to do so well on the first time around that you don't even care about that and you don't want to take it again. But anyway, it's very important to know how your school would look at the possibility of multiple LSAT scores, because then that's going to let you figure out exactly how tight you need to be with your preparation routine, exactly how confident you should feel when you go in the first day, or should you skip it, or should you postpone it, or whatever. It's very important to know how multiple scores would be viewed. Let me pause here for just a second and explain briefly why so many schools will average multiple scores. It has to do actually with something that's very important in the legal tradition, and that is the idea that lawyers and courts and judges and all of these different players in the legal drama, that they should all do things correctly the first time. Part of our legal system sort of rests on this foundational idea that you can't try a question more than once. Once a question is decided in the courtroom, it's decided forever. You may be familiar with an idea called double jeopardy, which says if you accuse someone of something and you have a trial and the trial proceeds and that person is found innocent, you can't just turn around and say, well, I'm pretty sure they're still guilty, I'm going to do this again. This is going back to this same idea. In order for our legal system to work, this will make more sense when you're actually in law school, but in order for the legal system to work, it has to be the case that when things are decided, they're decided forever. And so law schools try to get you used to this from the very beginning. This is why most law school courses will only have one exam at the end of the course, because, again, you need to be trained for this idea that when push comes to shove and the official moment arrives, so to speak, you need to perform. Whether that's good or not, I'm not here to say, but that is how the law works. It's how law school works, and it's how, in most cases, at most schools, the LSAT itself will also work. It's not really related to this video, but people often ask, well, why is that? That's kind of a stupid policy, and now you know where that's coming from. Okay, so kind of along these lines of how many times can you take the test, whether your school averages or not, the LSAC itself won't let you take it more than 3 times in 2 years. So again, it's not like the SAT, where you could just sit down and take it every single month if you wanted for 5 years in a row and nobody would stop you. On the LSAT, there is a number, there's a limit beyond which the LSAC will not let you take the test. So really, I think you can kind of get an idea from this. It's very important when you take the LSAT that you have some idea what you're doing, you have a plan, you go in, you execute, no stress or anything, and you just do what you're supposed to do. That's obviously the easiest and best way to handle it. You don't want to find yourself in a scenario where you've taken the test once and gotten like a 140, and now even if you take it again and get a 180, it's still going to average out to a 160 at a lot of schools. You don't even want to be messing with that, right? Just go in, know what to do it, be done. Okay, so the last thing I want to point out is the way the test is composed. So you have 3 basic question types. These aren't the official names of them, but I'm just going to call them this anyway. You have reading questions, you have arguments questions, and games questions. I'm calling them that because those are much simpler names than the stupid names the LSAC gave them. So reading questions are exactly what they sound like. You're going to read a passage, they're going to ask you a question about it, you're going to answer the question. Argument questions are actually exactly what they sound like, but they might not sound like anything. So an argument question basically involves a short sample argument in the question, which you read, and then the question asks something like, if all of those statements are true, then which statement in the answer choices follows logically from those statements? Or it might say something like, the preceding argument is vulnerable to criticisms on which of the following grounds, something along those lines. Basically, they're just asking you to talk about how a certain argument is put together. There are 2 sections of arguments on this test. And then finally you have the games section, and the games section are sort of these little brain teaser things you might have seen back in elementary school. Something where like somebody's throwing a dinner party and they're inviting 7 people and Susie can't sit next to Peter unless Quincy brings the apricots or whatever. They're harder on the LSAT probably than they might have been in elementary school, but it's that same type of game, and you'll have 1 section of those. So 1 section of reading, 2 of arguments, and 1 of games. There's also somewhere in the mix there is an experimental section which doesn't count and can be any one of those 3 types. But the things that are going to count, it's going to be 1 reading, 2 arguments, and a games. Okay, so that pretty much gets the basics out of the way. Let's talk about some very important ideas for preparation. The key to beating the LSAT, in my opinion, is understanding that the test is written according to certain standards. It's like the whole purpose of the test, if you think about it. The LSAT is useful to law schools because every single time the LSAT is given, supposedly it measures exactly the same things in exactly the same ways, and the only way it can do that is by adhering to certain specific patterns. Now, it doesn't tell us most of these patterns, but if you go ahead and look at a whole bunch of questions, it sort of becomes maybe not obvious, but you can pick these things out. And yeah, and that's why I recommend that as you prep for the LSAT, you only use real test questions. If you Google a phrase like LSAT prep tests or free LSAT practice or something like that, you're going to find dozens and dozens and dozens of really cheaply made websites that are all basically trying to get you to click and then click on an ad or something after you see their fake free LSAT questions. You don't want to do this. It's very, very important that you only work with questions from the actual LSAC itself. The LSAC, of course, is the company that administers the LSAT. You can get these from lsac.org or from amazon.com or from large bookstores, if there are still large bookstores when you're reading this. I don't know how much longer those are going to be around. Anyway, those are the places where you can get these real questions, and I strongly advise that you do that. If you practice with fake questions, there's no guarantee whatsoever that those fake questions are written according to the same standards as the actual test. I cannot tell you how many times a student or a potential student sends me an email and they're like, well, listen, I found this question and I can't do this question, and then the answer here is supposed to be A, but I'm pretty sure it could be either C or D. And then you look at the actual question, it's not a real LSAT question, it's one that's made up by one of these free websites, and the student is actually right. 2 of the answer choices would both be valid if this were a real LSAT question, which is obviously impossible, and the choice that the fake website is saying is correct would not be correct if it were an actual LSAT test. This happens all the time. So avoid the confusion. It's relatively inexpensive to get some real questions directly from Amazon or from the LSAC. Or you can actually go on the LSAC site itself and download some for free. That's also possible. One way or another, though, strongly advise you that you only work with real test questions. Okay, so those are kind of the universally agreed upon ideas about the LSAT. Now let's get into some things that are potentially controversial. So most LSAT courses out there are going to teach you to attack the test by using formal logic, things like necessity, stuff like that. If you have heard some of these terms on the screen here, contrapositive, whatever, then you've probably been kicking around in some of the normal LSAT hangouts, let's say, and I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with this whole formal logical idea. Because of this whole formal logical approach to the test, people often plan to spend a very significant amount of time prepping for the LSAT, and they plan to do multiple practice tests. In fact, there's like a whole industry of traditional LSAT prep courses in which it's sort of like this weird bizarro world where the courses will actually advertise how much time they take and how hard they are and complicated, and they'll be like, with this class you get 60 hours of in-depth classroom experience or whatever. The next one will be like, no, ours is better, it's 72 hours, which is weird because in most industries something that takes longer and is harder to do is less valuable than something that is faster, but well, that's where we're at. So in my opinion, I just want to put out there this idea that this whole notion of using formal logic and spending a lot of time to get ready for the LSAT is deeply flawed. The reason it's deeply flawed is because you don't have to use formal logic to attack the test. I'm going to go ahead and say that the LSAT is not actually a test of how well you can generate logical responses on your own. The LSAT is a test of how well you can eliminate incorrectly generated logical responses from a set of provided answer choices. I'm going to expand on that probably in another video, but for now, let's just leave it there, and let's just say I want to plant the seed at least that maybe you don't need to spend 70 or 80 hours or whatever it is sitting in a room full of other LSAT takers and diagramming things in a very boring way or whatever. So that's potentially controversial, and now I want to get into something that I'm pretty sure is controversial. And by the way, I'm not just being controversial for its own sake. I don't do that, but I'm pointing this out because I think it's true. I think you should at least consider it, and I know from years of experience that it will be controversial. So unfortunately, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that in a certain light, the LSAT is the easiest standardized test that's out there at the moment. Now, am I saying that if I just whisper some magic words to you, you'll know how to beat the LSAT in 2 minutes? Absolutely not. I am saying, though, that the underlying ideas that allow us to beat the LSAT in the most efficient ways are actually quite simple. It's not that they're hard ideas, it's not that we need to spend weeks and months and whatever learning how to diagram things in a formal way and all of this stuff. It isn't that. That isn't how you beat the test. But when you do know how to beat the test the easiest ways, a lot of people are going to want to practice it a little bit and play with it because it's maybe not natural right off the bat. So I'm not saying, again, that it's a 2-minute thing beating the test, but I am saying it shouldn't be a 6-month thing. It shouldn't be a 72 classroom hour thing, in my opinion. Now, there are definitely some timing issues on the LSAT if you use the formal logical approach, which, by the way, is one major clue that the formal logical approach is probably not the best way to go. So most people are going to have some timing issues on the LSAT. But let me point some other things out. There's 3 question types on the LSAT. If you think about the GMAT, the GRE, the SAT, even the ACT, they all have more question types than the LSAT has. On top of that, the LSAT has no math questions. All LSAT questions are text-based questions. On top of that, they all reward basically the same skill. They all reward some version of reading something very carefully and then reacting in a predetermined, conditioned way. That's it. You can't go through the SAT, for instance, doing only that. You can't go through the GMAT doing only that. On the LSAT, I would argue you can. People will disagree, but again, I just kind of want you to hear the argument. You can decide what you think. One other thing about the LSAT is there's no penalty for being wrong, whereas on many other standardized tests, in fact, every one I can think of except the ACT right now, in some way, you are penalized for being wrong, whether you actually lose points like on the SAT or whether the test just adjusts and makes itself like in a lower score range like the GMAT and the GRE, the computerized tests do. One way or another, you're penalized on most other things for being wrong, but not on the LSAT. Okay, so before you get mad at me, let me just go ahead and jump to the end of the video. I'm running up on my time limit here. You might have noticed I'm talking a blue streak, trying to get everything in time. If you want to learn more about some of these ideas, strongly advise you to register at aclsat.com. That is free, and you will receive a copy of my white paper. Also, please go ahead and check my blog out, www.testingIsEasy.com. You can see some cool stuff about my various courses. And that's it. So thank you very much. I think I'm just under 15 minutes. I'm going to let it go right here. And if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Thanks. Bye.